Hi, I'm James Connell, and my topic for assignment 1 is personality. So before I start, I'm going to define a few terms. Intolerance of uncertainty is generally characterized as negative emotions, thoughts, and behaviors towards an ambiguous situation. Someone may exhibit this as feeling that they are unable to cope with change. Psychological distress is a general term for symptoms of a poor emotional or mental state. Now, because of the unprecedented nature of the coronavirus pandemic we're currently in, it's changed a lot of what people consider normal parts of their life, whether it be education or social events or how they work. Consequently, the uncertainty of the pandemic will have a lasting and profound effect on the mental health of those affected. This makes intolerance of uncertainty a very relevant area of research at the moment. One of the findings from Zhao and Associates is that college students in Wuhan returning to school in the context of the coronavirus pandemic had an association between poor mental health outcomes and intolerance of uncertainty. They suggested that excessive worry for the unknown result in pressure and loneliness that influence anxiety and depression. They also found that their sample reported a higher intolerance of uncertainty than other studies measuring intolerance of uncertainty during the H1N1 pandemic of 2009. The limitations of this study is that it's a cross-sectional study, so the cause and effect can't confidently be attributed because it's a snapshot in time. Another limitation is that this population can't be generalized. It's a very specific group of people. This is a limitation found across many of the studies in this area. Strength of the study is that the self-reporting bias was reduced, or they worked to reduce it by assuring anonymity for the participants so that they didn't feel they needed to answer questionnaire in a specific way. These findings are also consistent with a previous Turkish study, as a fear of the coronavirus pandemic negatively influenced mental health. This uses the IUS-12 scale, the intolerance of uncertainty scale, a 12-item scale that is used among a lot of these studies. It's a strength because it allows this study to be compared with other studies that use the IUS-12 scale. Another study by Razor and Associates further supports the intolerance of uncertainty and psychological distress are positively associated with each other in a coronavirus pandemic context. Their suggestion is that a future study use a longitudinal study rather than a cross-sectional study. This would allow the determination of causation. The limitation of this study is that the participants were a convenient sample of Israeli parents. Again, this can't be generalized to another population. The data was cross-sectional, so causation can't be determined. Self-reporting data, unlike the previous study, they didn't work to reduce self-reporting bias because they didn't assure an anonymity to the participants. Strength of this study is that the IUS-12 scale was used again, and the K10 scale was used, which is also another very common scale in this area of research. The K10 scale is the Kessler Psychological Distress Scale. This is a 10-item scale. Another study by Smith and Associates is they concluded that intolerance of uncertainty increases the negative effects of social isolation has on mental health outcomes in the coronavirus pandemic context. Limitations is that, again, this was a very specific sample of white Americans, or was overrepresented by white Americans. They used a cross-sectional study design, but a strength is that they used the IUS-12 scale like the others. For a gap of literature, I've identified that among these studies, they all use a very specific population. So I think that this research could use a pool of populations that are more varied. So to add to this, I think Australia would be good because it's underrepresented in this area of research, and also it's a fairly multicultural society. Another gap in literature is that the papers like Zhao and Razor both focus on intolerance of uncertainty predicting psychological distress. Therefore, a gap in this literature is investigating psychological distress as a predictor for intolerance of uncertainty. To determine which factor is causative in a longitudinal study design will be necessary. Findings of this research may shed light on new ways of treating mental health in the coronavirus pandemic and future pandemics. So, for the aim of this study will be to investigate the psychological distress as a predictor for intolerance of uncertainty in Australians during the coronavirus pandemic. The hypothesis will be, it will be predicted that psychological distress using the K10 scale will increase intolerance of uncertainty using the IUS 12 scale in Australians during the coronavirus pandemic. Thank you for listening.